Okay, first thing that I want to show you about this, guys, is how to actually use a tether block. So a tether block is a way to keep your camera, keep a cable inside of your camera safely. This is what it looks like. It's sort of on the end right here. It starts out, and this is actually made, this is one that's made by, this is actually one that's made by Canon, for Canon. So you'll see that if you open up, this is sort of like what your connections, your USB connections look like. There's a screw on this one side, right here, and it fits into this little hole right here. So this comes up, it screws in, and so then this is actually set in like this. I know it's a little bit dark in there to see this, but that's what it actually looks like. There's two pieces to this. There's this clip that's on this very end right here. You pinch this, and pull this out. This is what the cabling actually goes into, is this thing right here. Sorry guys, I'm not really good at TV. Anyway, that's how your cabling goes in. So the way to set this up, the easiest way to do this is the first thing you do is actually take this little piece off and then plug your cable actually into the place where it goes inside the camera. There's two ports in here. There's just the only one this USB goes in is the bottom one. There's an HDMI one is at the very top. We don't use that. So this goes in like this. Take it back. Go ahead and add this piece back in first. It just slots in, it locks in. Then put your cable in correctly, like that. And then what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how to get, sorry, I'm trying to get in front of that screen so that you can sort of see these pieces. You're trying to get the cable to actually go to thread through one of these holes and then to come back out the other one. So to do that, you twist your cable around and you just sort of eyeball and you say to yourself, that's about what, you know, again, you can't have this too tight. That's about right on here to get this in, but you can't get it inside right here. So you pinch the cable like this, pull this out. Sorry, I need 3 hands. Can you do me a favor and hold this for me? Just hold that guy, just like that, perfect. So again, you twist the cable around so that it seems right, and you're not pinching it. Pull the cable out, then put this in to the first slot, loop this around, put it in the second slot, and then this whole thing just slides right back in. And that's how you do it. So it's just the easiest way to do it, and so you can see the cabling. The whole trick of this is that what you're hoping to do is that if somebody pulls on this cable, the lower cable part, that it doesn't yank it out of your camera. The problem that we have with a lot of this stuff is that when stuff gets yanked out of this camera, it takes the USB port out with it, and that's a very expensive fix. So, okay, so to that point, in everything that we do, you'll see it when we start to work over here on this set that I've also anchored the other end of the USB cable to the computer, because that's, again, people trip on this stuff all the time, and if that happens, then all of a sudden it yanks the cord out of the computer and takes that USB port out as well. So you'll see I just wrap stuff around. A lot of people will tape stuff to like the leg of a cart. I mean, there's a million different ways that you can actually do this, but the thing that you shouldn't do is just plug it in and expect it to work, because it won't. Okay, so exposure equivalence. That's going to be the theme of the day today. I'm going to get this moved around a little bit so that you can see what's going on. Perfect. Okay. So, did everybody work on memorizing their f-stops? Right? Okay, again, this is your language. If you can't speak it, people will pick up on that right away, and you will be dead in the water. You'll never get asked back. So we're going to start with that part really quickly. Yeah, good. So I'm going to start at F2.8. What's one stop down? 4. Next stop. Next stop. Next. 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 And finally. That did all come out on there. Okay, good. And what is the difference in, if I go from F16 to F22, is it more light or less light? How much less?
Half.
I've cut it in half, right? If I go from F8 to 5.6, more light or less light? How much? Double. Again, doubling and halving, doubling and halving, doubling and halving. This is going to be true of all of the systems that we use. And the advantage of that is that it makes all of those systems somewhat interchangeable. So we're going to start out with a typical scenario right here. I'm going to put an ISO. We're going to do this in columns. I'm going to do an ISO here. I'm going to do apertures here. And I'm going to do shutter speeds here. And we're just going to do a chart of these. And I'm going to start with a typical average, just an average exposure. I'm just pulling this out of my head. So again, let's just say you do a metering thing, whatever. And you have a 100 ISO, and you're shooting at f8, and it's 125th of a second. Pretty average exposure for outdoor shooting, that kind of stuff on a typical day. So nothing really all that great about that, nothing about that. So I shoot a picture, and the art director looks at it and says, well, okay, this is great. I mean, I love this part, whatever, but there's motion in this. I want somebody to be running. I want somebody to be, I need action. We're outside, we're shooting for Nike. I need action, I need movement, I need all of that. How fast do you need to shoot to actually freeze a person running? What? I heard a 500th, I think. Go for it.
If you're using strobes, which you use.
I'm not using strobe, I'm shooting outside. There's no strobe involved yet. We're gonna get to strobe in a minute. 500 to 1,000. I feel like an auctioneer. I hear 500. Do I have 1,000? Do I hear 1,500? No. So here's the truth of the matter. If you've got somebody running straight at you, there's not a lot of motion side to side. Focus tracking is your challenge. You can get away with the 500th, but if you've got somebody crossing your screen, it will not stop. It won't stop them. It'll stop a slow walk, but it won't stop somebody running. 1,000th is a minimum. 2,000 and you're more secure. It's just a really smart thing to think about because, again, you go into this situation, photographer says, oh, I can shoot that 125th of a second. You, as the assistant, you pipe up and say secretly to them, not in front of the creatives, but next to them, no, you can't. You will never freeze them. Now, if they're looking for motion, if they want, dragging your shutter and they really want that streak and the blur and all that kind of stuff, great, but that's not what we're talking about here. Freezing it, right? So, in this scenario here, I want to get to a 2,000th of a second. That's going to be my goal in all of this, right? So I need to ask myself, in terms of shutter speeds, what is the difference in 125th and a 2,000th of a second? So before we get to that, I'm going to lose from 45 to 64 over here just because I need room over here. I'm going to do whole shutter speeds to begin with. So in the old days, with mechanical cameras, you actually set these things because they were mechanical shutters. So we still have view cameras here today that have mechanical shutters in them, and you have to actually set them. But in most cases now, you've got digital cameras, and digital cameras can do really weird shutter speed numbers, especially if you set stuff to auto. They can do really incremental shutter speeds that you would never, ever, ever use. But there is a standard set, and you guys see it all the time. All of us know that a 60th of a second, 125th of a second, a 30th of a second. You see that all the time in metering, on your cameras, all of that stuff. Does that make sense, everyone? So that's the stops, that's the range we're going to do. So I'm going to start with 1 full second. So again, this is going to be my shutter speed ranges up here. 1 full second. What would be 1 stop down from 1 full second? Be a half a second, right? Again, doubling and halving. It's the same scale. What's half of that? Quarter. So people get all flipped out about the math in all of this. They're like, oh, fractions, just not my thing, man. I'm math phobic. I hate that. No, whatever. And I always say to them, okay, think about money, right? If I had $1 and I said I'm going to give you half of it, what would you expect? 50 cents. A half of it, right? If I said I'm going to give you half of that again, what would you expect? A quarter, right? They even call it a quarter. So don't get flipped out about fractions. You guys deal with this shit all the time. It's just how important it is to you. If it's money, it's really important, so you know that shit. If it's shutter speed, you're like, fuck that, I'm gonna let the camera take care of it. As long as I'm shooting digital and I'm within 3 or 4 stops, I'll be fine. Right? Wrong. All right. So quarter is my next one down. What's my next one down? An eighth. Next one down. Here it gets tricky. Now, in all honesty, it should be a 16th, but a 16th starts to complicate the math. They want to keep this less complicated. So instead of going to a 16th, they go to a 15th, because that sets us up to have a really nice even set of doubling and having shutter speeds going all the way up to an 8,000th of a second. So the next one is going to be a 15th. The next one is a 30th. The next is a 60th. The next is a 125th. You guys can't see it after a 60th, so I'm going to put 125th up on the board over here. What would be my next one? Exactly. And my next one? And my next one? And my next one? And my next one? And my final one? Yeah, we got it in there. So this is my range of whole shutter speeds going all the way from 1 second to an 8,000th. There.
This might be like kind of a dumb question, but like when you're shooting with most, strobes for like cameras, they cap out at like a 200th of a second.
You are so ahead of the game. We are going to deal with all of that today.
It's like it stops at like 250. So just
We are going to deal with all of that today. No, some cameras it doesn't.
Well, yeah.
Oh, and there's other tricks there's gear that you can use to actually get around that. So all of that we're learning today, I hope. But anyway, I'm not strobes here. This is no strobes. This is just available light. Is everybody good on this part? Okay. So when I go from 125th of a second down to a 2,000th of a second, is that more light or less light? Less light. How much less? So here's the trick. Do not try to think you've memorized at this scale. Do it one at a time. Just say to yourself, okay, I'm at 125th. I'm going to go to a 250th. That's 1 stop less. A 500, 2, 1,000, 3, 2,000, 4. I have lost 4 stops of light. Does that make sense, everyone? We good on this part? Okay, so I've lost 4 stops of light. I need to then compensate for that. I want to stay at my 100 ISO. I'm going to just do this with apertures. So that means I need more light to compensate for what I just lost. Right? How much more do I need? 4 stops. So if I'm at f8, what is 4 stops more light? 5, 6 would be 1 stop, 4 would be 2 stops, 2.8 would be 3 stops, f2 would be 4 stops. I don't have f2 on my camera. I've actually got f2.8 on my camera. What do I do?
Then you have to increase your ISO.
Exactly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up to f2.8, but that only gives me 3 stops, right? f8 to 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. So I'm getting there, but I'm not there yet. I have to actually add 1 more stop by changing my ISO to 200. Yes?
I thought the next one was 160.
In f-stops?
Yeah.
Or in ISOs? In ISOs?
Yeah.
Again, what would a doubling and halving be? We haven't done the range for ISOs yet. Let's do them right now. So for ISOs, in most cases, in a 35 millimeter, most of them, the standard is 100 ISO. There's settings that you could use to go in, and the custom settings on all cameras, not all, but I know on Nikon and Canon and Sony you can go in to actually extend that range to get down to 50, but also the limit is usually 3200 ISO. You can actually extend it to 128,000 ISO. Those are all special settings that you have to do. My advice to you is do not do those special settings, especially the one that actually opens this up to 50. It tries to step on your exposure and it can't really do it, and you'll run into trouble. So we're going to start with 100. What's doubling of 100? What's doubling of 200? What's doubling of 400? What's the doubling of 800? And the doubling of that? And the doubling of that? And the doubling of that? This one is a special one to get to, and then again, this 50 up here, you have to do special settings to do that. I strongly suggest that you do not do that. This is the range that we work in here. So that 160 is actually not going to be a full stop more. That 160 is how much more?
And if you're getting 160, would that be the third stop show?
It is meaning I am in thirds of stops. So this is the challenge that we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but again, the question came up and it's important. No, it's important to answer and to deal with it when it comes up, right? So this is how you figure out stuff in between all of this. Most of you have got your camera set up to work at 1/3 stop increments, correct? Some of you will have half stops. 1/3 is a little bit more precise. I say that, but there's times where you go out and meter something outdoors and it'll say, well, you need to be shooting at 8.5. And in that case, you have to decide, do I want to do 8 1/3 or 8 2/3? I don't do the numbers in between here. I keep this simple. So for me, I do not do, so if you go from F16 to, 11 to 16, I think it's like 11 and then it's like 13, I forget what the middle stops are in between this, whatever. I don't ever do that. I do 11 to 11 1/3 to 11 2/3 to 16. That's how I do everything. It's how everybody does everything. So nobody's going to say to you, oh, give me F7 or whatever. It's 6.4, whatever it is. Nobody deals with those. It's too many numbers to remember, right? I'm just making this simple for you guys. So at any rate, if you've got 100 ISO, and we know that a 200 ISO is a full stop, so that's plus one stop, right? What is this? What's the difference in, if I subtract 100 from 200, what do I have? 100, and if I divide that by 3, what do I get? 33. So 133 and 166 equals, so let's say that this is F11 right here, this would be 11 1/3 here, this would be 11 2/3 here, and this would be 16. Make sense? So the 160 is actually a 2/3 stop. It's not a full stop. We're not working in full stops. Are we good on this part? Don't worry, we're gonna get back to this in a second.
Another question.
Yeah.
So is it more common when shooting film photography? That's why I asked, because I know there's some girls that are 160 ISO.
They do. They actually said, and the reason that they actually do that is that, or this is just my opinion of it. So film shooters in here, how many? Oh, good. I love that part, right? Anybody in here shoot black and white? Anybody in here shoot Tri-X? What do you shoot then?
Yeah.
What?
I shoot Ilford.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. So anyway, Tri-X was like if you go back and you look at the history of black and white photography, especially news photography, whatever, Tri-X just dominates. It's a film that was made by Kodak. It had an ISO, or in the case of back in the film days, an ASA of 400. Nobody shot it at 400. It had the ability to really deal with overexposed highlights well. So people would overexpose their images just to be able to get the shadow detail because they knew that the film could handle a slight amount of overexposure. So all of us re-rated it at 320. So a 320 is actually, again, if we do the same thing, if you go from 400 to 200, that's actually a full stop. So it would be opening up a third, right? We would give it a third more exposure by re-rating it at 320. So many people did this for so long that Kodak actually released a version of Tri-X rated at 320, and they just called it the professional version. It's the same fucking film. There's nothing different except for the package. The package and the little directions that came inside. That was the only difference. So what's happening with the Kodak, so it's the color films, like the NC films, that kind of stuff, whatever. They were all designed to be shot at 200, but again, everybody shot it at 200. They're overrating how sensitive their film really is. And so they re-rated at 160. But again, in color film, negative film, whatever, you've got a lot of latitude. So it's not that important, as important as it is with transparency film. So all the film shooters in here, anybody here shoot transparency film? Yeah.
Is that the color positive?
It is.
Oh.
Yeah. It is the single hardest thing that there is to do in photography.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna just, I tell this story eventually at some point during every class, or most of them, whatever. So when you shoot transparency film, you can underexpose it by a half a stop and then increase that in processing. You can get over that half stop in processing. But if you overexpose it by any amount and you try to hold it in processing, it fucks your film up to the point you can't use it. So there is no overexposing. If you overexpose it, you can't use it. Even worse, it's the color that you shoot is baked into it. So in the color, you actually have to filter everything to get the color that it needs to be. Because if you're shooting outside and you've got a bright sunny day, you'll have one color temperature, but when the clouds come in, you have another color temperature. And it just, so when I would shoot color transparency film outside, I had two assistants. And one of them would hold a light meter right next to my subject and give me readings. They would just yell them out. So it would be 8 1/3 at 125th, 8 1/3 at 125th, but then there would be an assistant on the other side calling out filters that I needed to be using, because as this light would change, the worst nightmare of all photographers is that day where it's like cloudy and sunny at the same time. You know, you've got the sun, clouds are covering over the sun and then uncovering, you know, that, because your exposure's jumping all over the place, but your color is jumping radically all over the place. So there I am sitting with my camera madly unscrewing filters and changing filters on, but filters all have different densities. So the true exposure, you've got to refigure the exposure plus what we would call a filter factor. So that's an 81B, that's a third stop on top of that. So it's not 8 1/3, it's actually 8. That's what you need to be, you know. And so the assistant doing the exposure part is actually having to calculate that. So we had a whole log sheet that had all of this table on it that would allow them to go to something really quickly to adjust the exposure. And they're yelling that out to me the whole time. So I was only shooting medium format, and so a roll of film for me was 10 exposures. And they would mark down when a light change would happen in the middle of that roll, so that we would go to the lab and we would say, they would do clip tests. So they would actually snip off the first frame or two, and they had to guess because you can't see where a frame is until you develop it. So they're in the lab, they clip off the first hunk of film and they would process it, and then we would look at it and then make adjustments. Oh, if that's a third under, you need to add a third. But if the second half of the roll was a different lighting, they would have to clip that as well. And then we would look at the log and we would say, okay, well the first 2/3 of that roll were shot this way, so I need you to process it this way, and the second 2/3 were done, or the second third was done this way. There was 300 or 400 people in the US that could do that consistently, and I was one of them. And I got paid an absolute fortune to do it. You guys don't have that anymore. You have digital, which eliminates most of the exposure issues, but it eliminates all the color issues. So for you, it doesn't matter. You shoot in varying light. All you need to worry about is exposure. You don't really need to worry about color, because raw files don't know what color is. You tell it. Yeah. So be careful what you want in life.
That explains a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so back to this. So I'm going to leave this up, our scale up here like this. So I get to here, so I've got my 2000th. I do have the same, so this is a normal exposure. This is a normal exposure. But the art director then looks at it and says, well, that's all hunky-dory, but this is Nike. I want this shit tack sharp. I want really extended depth of field. I want this. I want to be able to, this is, you know, you've got the person in focus, but the background drops right out immediately because you're shooting wide open. I'm at f2.8 here. And I say to them, okay, I need to get down to f11. So I'm going to shoot at f11. I'm still at my 1/2000th of a second, but I am no longer at a normal with this exposure if I keep this at 200. So what I need to do is I need to, when I stop down from f2.8 to f11, am I increasing my light or decreasing my light? How much in stops?
4.
No. f2.8 to 1, 2, 3, 4. I lied. So in this case, I've lost 4 stops of light. I can't change my shutter speed because I'm trying to freeze this person. I need f11 to get my depth of field, right? So what is the last variable that I can change? My ISO. And so I need 4 more stops of ISO, correct? So again, if my ISO is right now is 200, 400 is 1, 2, 3, 4. I need an ISO of 3200 And this is now also a normal exposure. What's the downside of this 3200?
Range.
Exactly, noise. So what do we do about that? The noise suppression stuff, not only in camera but and post, has gotten remarkable. Now, I wouldn't be happy, I wouldn't go into something and say, I really want to shoot at 3200 ISO, but I would have absolutely no problem shooting at 1200, 1600, not with cameras, a current camera today. If you own a 5D Mark II, 2000 era Canon camera, maybe not quite that hard, but certainly the Sonys today, the Canon, Nikon, that kind of stuff today, that in combination with the software in Camera Raw and Photoshop and in Lightroom, whatever, can really stomp on that grain enough to make it usable. Yes?
What ISO would you say has it should be avoided because there's too much noise?
So again, I am comfortable going up to a 1200 ISO and not even think about it. So in that case right here, it would be right in this range in here. So again, 1200 ISO would be right in this middle range right here. It would be right between 800 and 1600. Does that mean I won't go to 1600? No, I would rather actually have grain to deal with in underexposure. We will talk about why underexposure is your absolute worst enemy. Questions about any of this? Are we good on this part right here? Is this all making sense to everyone? So then let's say take it one last step, and then the art director goes, well, okay, I love all these pictures and we've got all this, but now what I really want to do is I want to get a sense of motion, but I also want to know that it's a figure, right? I mean, I don't want to go to a 1 minute exposure, because if a person moves at 1 minute exposure, it's just like, wow, I don't know what that is. It's a blob, right? So, but something where you can say, yeah, okay, yeah, I know that's a person and that's a person moving. How slow could you go? I'm sorry? No, in 2/5 of a second, if they're not moving, they'll be tack. Yeah, I mean, they're going to be moving a little bit, right? You know, but I'm just saying, you're trying to get some sense of motion in there, but also some kind of freezing them, so to speak, you know? For me, the sweet spot in there is probably around a 30th or a 15th of a second. So I'm just going to pick a 30th of a second, and they'll say, okay, we've got the frozen stuff, but now we want a sense of, you know, a little bit of motion in here. So I'm going, okay, fine, we're going to go to a 30th of a second right here. So again, in my calculation down here, I'm now going to a 30th of a second. So how much is that different from my 2000th in stops? So again, if I go from a 2000 to 1000 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. More light or less light?
More light.
So I've added 6 stops of light. I need to then remove 6 stops of sensitivity in order to do this, correct? Right? So, and that's keeping me at F11 here. So if I want to remove, so this move that I've made right here, right now, at a 30th, if I keep everything else the same, I've got a +6 stop. So instead, I can actually start to drop down my ISO, because that would be what I would go after first, right? So if I've got my ISO at 3200, I go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I can't go down anymore. So I'm going to go to 100 ISO, but then I need to actually stop down to F16 to lose 6 stops. Does this make sense? So again, in my changing, so when I went from a 2000 to a 30th, I bumped it by 6 stops, 6 stop increase in exposure. But when I went from a 3200 to a 100, again, 32, 1, 2, 3, 4, that knocks off 5 stops, but I'm still 1 stop overexposed. So then I go from 11 down to 16, 1 more stop, and now I'm at normal here again. And you can do this all day long. Is this making sense, everybody? Are we good on this part? Okay, so now it starts to get a little more complicated. We're going to add another component to this. We are not going to be outside. We're actually going to go inside. I'm going to go back to my original setup here at 125th. But now I'm going to add strobe. So in strobe, what we do is we measure things in watt seconds. So you also deal with them in stops, but anyway, we're going to deal with these in watt seconds. So in dealing with watt seconds, we also have a scale that's very, very, very similar to this. I'm going to drop it right down here. So in my watt second scale, most studio power packs, the full-blown versions, are 2400 power packs. There are some exceptions, but Brown Color is an exception. I think Brown Color does theirs at 3000 or at 3200. But Pro Photos, all the professional lines, not the D2s that we've got, but they're more the individual power pack and setup heads are at 2400 watt seconds. There are some people who actually double this up. For instance, we actually have some here. There's Speedotron packs here that will do 4800 watt seconds. They're double the power of a typical Speedotron pack that you actually have. They weigh a ton, but anyway, yeah. So I'm going to start at 2400 watt seconds. And again, this is a case of doubling and halving, right? So one step down from 2400 watt seconds would be how many watt seconds? Exactly, just doubling and halving, guys. Half of 2400 is 1200. And what's half of that? And half of that? And half of that? And half of that? And half of that? We're just going to call it 37. I'm going to round it down to 36. Half of that would be 16. Half of that would be 8. Half of that would be 4. Half of that would be 2. And half of that would be 1. I don't really know any pack that'll give you a 1 watt second output. But anyway, so this would roughly be the scale that we've actually got going in here. So I am not going to use this particular scale. We are just going to treat this as the doubling and halving part of this. So I'm going to throw you a curve here. I'm going to actually say my normal exposure on this is at 800 watt seconds, which is not any of these. It's more than 6, it's less than 12, but that part doesn't matter. This is really just a case now of this is my current scale now, right? So again, I'm shooting here, I'm in the studio, and we do a shot, I don't know, whatever it is, and the art director says, oh, you're shooting beauty. Oh, so this is actually, it's interesting. 100 ISO at 100 f8 at 120, that's my standard for shooting folding fashion. That's where I go to all the time. That's my, it's not where you have to go, and you may not shoot fashion, so that part wouldn't even matter. But when I shoot beauty, I actually need more depth of field, because when you come in really tight, again, you have a much shallower sense of depth of field. So I like to extend that. So for my beauty stuff, I like to go to f16. So I would be down here at 16. Does shutter speed matter? I've got to know why. I am working with strobes. Well, hold that thought. You're absolutely right. If we get above my sync speed, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, but I'm asking if I went to say like a 60, no.
Shutter speed only matters when you're working with strobe if you need some kind of like background exposure or like exposure that's not coming from the strobe light. Because other than that, as long as like you're not going to get any sync issues with the shutter speed, then it doesn't really matter because it's not making the light exposure. What would matter is the ISO and the f-stop.
Right, but I'm asking why it doesn't matter.
Because like the light is that like it goes off and then it's the, you know, if you're shooting at 200 or like 1 second, the light only goes off for that quick burst. So
you're exactly right. You're exactly right. So what we need to talk about now or think about now is what they call flash duration. It's how fast does the flash turn on and turn off. Flash duration matters a lot to us because we have two wildly divergent systems here in the studio. We have one that's got an extremely slow flash duration, which is Speedotron, and we have one that's got an extremely fast one, which is Pro Photo. So what basically matters here is this. This is how this whole thing works. Get rid of some of it. I'll come back to my 16 right here. I need space to draw this out for just a second. I'll put this back up. So if you do a graph, and again, don't let graphs bother you or worry you. If you're not minded like this, you will still understand this whole process, what happens. So in this scenario right here, what we're going to do on this graph is we are going to map power against time. And so this is my 0, 0 point. And so this is going to map of the way a strobe actually works, the way it, when the flash, what's the process for it, what really happens. And so what happens is that you start out in a situation, your camera's hooked up, and you press the shutter button and it's connected to a strobe. It's either connected wirelessly or it's connected via a cord or however it's or it's a flash on camera, whatever it is. You push the button and what happens is that the strobe energy starts to go into the tube. There's a very small lag in the middle, and then depending on your strobe, it'll come up really high in power and then drop down really quick in power and then die. That's basically what happens. So if we say to ourselves here, this is my 0 point here, this is where we're going to begin it, and I set my shutter speed right here, and this is 125th of a second, what you'll see is, in the case of like a speed light or a ProPhoto, that the real exposure, the real meat of this light when it goes off is incredibly fast. In the case of a ProPhoto, this happens at a 1/8000th of a second. So if my flash turns on and off in an 1/8000th of a second, my shutter stays open much longer. It doesn't matter. If I go to a 60th of a second, it's just longer still. If I go to a 30th of a second, it's even longer still. So Larry was right about this. What ends up happening then is that your shutter speed only controls ambient light, the light that's actually on. If you go into a studio and you turn all the lights out and you turn your modeling light off, shutter speed doesn't matter at all. You can open your camera up and leave it open for 5 minutes and just hit your strobe once and it won't change the exposure at all because there's no other light. However, if you've got all of these lights on, then all of a sudden these lights start to add to your exposure. Does that make sense? So this whole thing about shutter speed is irrelevant until we get into what we call sync speed. We're going to look at shutters a little bit later. So it doesn't really matter to me. For me, if I want to go back to my situation right here, we're going to get through this part really quickly, guys, and then we'll take a break. If I go back to my f16 part right here, it doesn't matter whether I change this 125th. If I were to say, because again, I'm stopping down, what's the difference in 8 and 16? Remember, I'm stopping down to do my beauty shots. I need greater depth of field. That's why I've stopped down. F16 has got more depth of field than F8, right? We all know this? We're all comfortable with that part? Okay, so I'm stopping down. How much am I stopping down? 2 stops, right? And it's less light, correct? So I need to compensate for that. I need more light, correct? Okay, so in the case of strobe, I can actually do the same thing. I can go, I can go from 800 to what? Well, 1600 will give me 1 stop, but 32 will give me, and I don't have F32. So what do I do? Exactly. So I can go to 1600 watt seconds. That'll give me a +1, and then I can also go to a 200 ISO, and that will give me a +1 as well. And those two the additional sensitivity and the additional power will get me to F16, and my exposure will be the same. Are we good on this part? Is this sort of making sense to everyone? So watt seconds work the same way as all of these other things in terms of how you calculate thirds of a stop in the middle. So let's say that I'm actually shooting and I do a meter. Do you guys have apertures that you love? Do you have a standard? You don't have to. I just was curious. You're a 5.6 guy. You're a 11 person. I'm an 11, an 8. You and me, girl. Come on. Right? We're the smart ones, right? We don't ask for too much in life, but we want enough, right? I used to work with a photographer. His thing was always f5.6, and half of his film was out of focus. And I would always say in my mind, I would just say, God, if you would just stop down another stop, you would, at least, instead of half of it being out of focus, only a quarter of it would be out of focus. But anyway. So the way you figure out in between stuff, I'm going to lose all of these scales over here because you guys have this, right? Right? There's a video of it. You can shoot this with your phone right now if you want to really quickly. Okay, good. No fingers. So what happens in this is everybody uses watt seconds or power of your strobes to do as much of the changing as you can. Because none of us really, I mean, 100 ISO, it's got the least amount of noise, it's the ideal place to be, it's where most people, studio people want to actually stay, or whatever the native ISO of your camera is. The native ISO of the medium format cameras here is 50. We talked about that the other day. The only options on that camera, on the medium formats here, are 50, 100, 200, 400, and 800, and I told you, if you get up to like 400, it looks like you're shooting on sandpaper. It's so noisy, there's no way to step on that. And you get to 800, and you damn near can't tell it's a photograph. It's more like a mosaic. Yeah, okay. So anyway, I want to shoot at f8, that's my thing. This is my target right here. I want to shoot at this. So 100 ISO, f8, 125th, and I'm at 800 watt seconds. And again, I want to be shooting at f8, but I actually do a meter reading, and my meter says 5, 6, and a third. What do I do? Do I need more light or less light?
Less.
I'm at 5, 6, and a third. I need to be at f8. If I do less light, then I'm liable to go to 5, 6 or f4. That's not what I want. This is the tricky part. You need to start thinking in the opposite way now. So most of us are accustomed to changing our cameras to deal with a fixed light. We're not doing that anymore. We're changing the light to deal with a fixed camera, right? So if I turn my power down, I'm not going to get an increase in exposure, I'm going to get less. Let's think about it in an extreme. If I've got, let's say I'm a meter at f2.8 and I really want to be at f22. So I'm metering and my thing says, oh yeah, you need to shoot this at f2.8. And I say, well, I really want to be at 22. So I set my camera to f22 and I do a picture. Is that going to be underexposed or overexposed?
Underexposed.
Massively underexposed, right? So in order to compensate for that, I need more light. The same trick right here. If I need this to go, let's stop the third. I'm just going to do a full stop right now just to make it, we'll do a third of a stop in a second. So I'm metering is at 5, 6, but I want to be at f8. I need more light in order to stop down and be at f8 and have that be the correct exposure, right? Oh, God. I know this is going to only get more confusing. Don't worry, but hopefully the exercises that we do next week, in addition to what we go through today, will help get this sort of more solidified in your brain. Are we good on this part? Okay. So what's going to happen is that if I shot at f5, 6, I'd be fine. If I opened up my camera, right after my metering is at f5, 6, and I opened up my camera and shot it at 5, 6, I would be fine. But I don't want to be there. I want to be at f8. So I stop down to f8. That's giving me less light. I need now more light. How much more light do I need? One stop, right? So I'm at 800 watt seconds. What is one stop more? 1600 watt seconds, exactly. So I go to 1600. I do another metering again, and I end up with f8, and I shoot at f8, and life is grand. Make sense? So this is a case, I mean, this is the hardest part, I think, when people flip to the studio, and especially strobe stuff, is the whole idea that you're now changing the amount of light, you're changing the power, you're not changing the exposure. The exposure part is a fixed thing on your camera. What you're changing is how much light you're actually putting out. And that's how you're controlling your exposure. It's now just based on watt seconds. Are we good on this part? Okay, this seems like a really good time to take a break. It says 2:08 there. I'm going to be generous, guys. We'll call it a 2:10. Be back at 20 after. Hard 10 or hard 11.
Do you need me to put the sandbags away and record the light wave?
If that would be great. If you want to do that, that would be terrific. Yeah, hang on one second. Let me just pause this. Okay, so going back, Liam had a question about if you are in a situation where you've got, where are you? There you are. Where you've got a case.
This just came off when I tried.
Then get rid of this guy and just try it off of a different hard drive.
Okay.
Somehow we'll get this to you guys today, I swear. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the question was that you've got a photographer, you're working with a photographer, and they want to shoot film as well. And so you're all set up here to actually shoot this 100 ISO, f8, 125th of a second, and 800 watt seconds. You're shooting in the studio. And you need to make that adjustment. So we need to actually go, and let's say they do a typical color negative film that's got 160 ISO, right? So what we're doing is that we're going from 100 ISO to 160 ISO. Is this greater or less sensitivity? I'm sorry, what?
From 100 to 160.
Yeah, if I'm going from 100 to 160, is my 100 sensor, my 100 ISO sensor, more sensitive to light or less than the 160 ISO film?
I mean, your 100 is less, sir.
Yeah, the 100 is less. The 160 is more sensitive. How much more? How did you calculate that? No, roughly, because that's how everyone does it. So this is how you calculate it. So if I've got 100 ISO, what's one full stop more sensitive than that? 200. So I'm going to put the 200 down here. I'm going to pull this 160 out from the middle. So again, the distance right between the two, if I was in half stops, I would have 150 would be a half stop in the middle. So I would need a half stop more, but I'm going to 160, that's not the case. So instead I'm going to divide this by 3, because again, I'm working in thirds. Those are my only really options, guys. You can't get more discriminating than either plus a third, plus or minus a third, plus or minus a half, plus or minus 2/3, or then you're at the full stop, right? So again, the distance between 100 and 200 is 100. If I divide that by 3, I get 33, and actually I get 33.33333 forever. So I'm just going to do 33. So if I'm saying this is going to be f8 for me, because that's where I am, and I go to 133, that's going to be 8 1/3. If I go to 166, that's going to be 8 2/3. And then by the time I get to 200, I'm at 11. Right? So those are what my options are in this. So again, in order for me to go up to this 166, which would be right about here, I would tell my photographer, you need to then stop down to 8 2/3. So we are no longer shooting here. So my 160 here is going to be 8 2/3, still at 125th, and at 800 watt seconds. And he goes, well, that's shitty. I don't want to do that. I want to stay at f8. And you say, okay. So I'm going to go to f8 here. I'm still doing a 160 ISO. I'm still going to be 125th. But now I need to change my watt seconds. How many watt seconds do I change this to be? So again, I've gone, this is going to be the same. I'm going to pull this one out of the middle so I'm not confusing anybody. I'm going to just say here, this is where we are. So I've gone from, I'm staying at f8, I'm staying at 125th. I've got to move from this ISO here. He wants to stay at this aperture. He doesn't want to change that, or she doesn't want to change that, or they do not want to change this. So I'm just going to go down to here. So again, this is an increase of 2/3 sensitivity. So if I just shoot straight like this, I'm going to be 2/3 of a stop overexposed, correct? If I don't change anything except going from a 100 ISO to 160 ISO, I don't change anything else, I will be 2/3 of a stop over. If my f8 is normal, if this is normal right here, and I don't change anything else, I'm going to leave this at 800 right here, I will be 2/3 of a stop overexposed. Because I increased my sensitivity, I didn't change anything else. Right? So my one option, again, is to go to 8 2/3. I've stopped down 2/3, so now this will be normal. So this changes to normal. But that photographer doesn't want to do that. They want to stay at f8. So instead, I need to change what? I can't change my ISO. That's only going to go up. It's only will make, again, it's fixed in the film. I can't change this. It's fixed. So I've got to change my watt seconds. That's the only thing I can do. That's the only change that I can make in this, right? So I've added 2/3 of sensitivity here. I need to lose 2/3 sensitivity in order to still have a normal exposure, correct? So if I am up here, I've got 800 watt seconds. I need to lose 2/3 of the stop. That's my goal here, is to do that. What's one stop loss? Exactly, 400 would be one stop loss, right? What's the difference between 800 and 400? It's also 400. 400 divided by 3. Again, I'm going to do thirds of a stop. Hang on 1 second. Sorry, I completely forgot how to divide. I spell about the level of a 6th grader. If it wasn't for spell check, it would just, you know. But the insidious thing about that is that not only is my spelling horrible, but now spell check has made me so lazy when it comes to that shit. Now I'm probably really at the level of a 3rd grader instead of a 6th grader I was at for years, and now it's even worse, right? Oh my God, this is, and not only that, I'm recording this, and now I'm going to put it up on my channel and everything. Anyway, this is absolutely humiliating. Okay, so 3 into 4 goes 1. 3 under here, I've got 1 0 here. 3 into that goes 3, 9. I've got 1 0. So again, it's 133 difference in here. So if I add in my sensitivity here, if I put this at 533, that would be the 1/3 shift here. And if I then go to 66 to 666, wow, that's foreboding. If I go to 666, so again, to go from an ISO of 800, this would be here, to 666 would be losing 1/3 of the stop. To go to 533 would be losing 2/3 of the stop. So that's actually going to be my target. If I can take my power pack down, that's where I would go. Yes?
I would quickly on this turn a little switch on top, down, 2/3 of the stop.
Oh, of course you can, but you're actually doing this under the hood. Right? So there is no way really on that pack to actually get to 533. But again, dropping down 2/3 of the stop on the pack, which we are going to look at right now, actually. Other question?
Did you want me to ask something about the lens now? Or are we gonna go?
No. What was the question about the lens?
Oh, like, did they talk about the sweet spot?
Oh yeah. So the question is that where's the sweet spot in the lens? So for the most part, the thing that you need to remember about, bring that up again when we talk about shutter speeds. No, because I can show it to you. I've got an example of the two things that are fighting it and what creates the sweet spot. So it's a conversation for them. Okay, I'm going to stop the video recording right now. We're going to go into the studio. We're actually going to try and work this out and see how this works. So I am going to stop this. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, since we've spent a great deal of time trying to figure out f-stops and the relationship and all of that kind of stuff, whatever, what I'd like to get into now is a way that we can actually take this further. Because so far we've been doing it about, it's kind of like what you wanted. I want to shoot at f8 so I can make these adjustments to get to f8. I want to shoot it at a 2,000th of a second so I can make these adjustments to get there. But it puts you in immediate control. Instead of having to waste all of this time remetering and trying to figure this out and that out and this and the other out, whatever, it just lets you get there so much faster. And again, this is what photographers, this is what just that whole community of people in a professional studio, this is what they expect. So when I say to you, okay, I need to be at a 2,000th of a second, and I really quickly figure out, okay, well, that's a 4-stop increase. Do you know that means your ISO is going to be 3,200 instead of 800? I mean, it's having that, that is the language, that is that conversation. And you will hear this all the time. A photographer say, you need to bring me up a stop. You need to take me down a stop. I need to knock a third off of that. I need to add a third here. I mean, that's the language that everyone is speaking. And so you automatically know if somebody says, I need a third more, and you're metering f8, you know you need to get at 8 1/3, right? 8 1/3. So again, all meters work on a 10-point decimal scale. So 8.3 is 8 1/3. 8.6 or 7 is 8 2/3. And then 11 is 11. Make sense? Are there any questions about this part? This is so fundamental to what happens in this class. Yes?
Why do meters work on a 10.67? Like,
So what's interesting about that is that they were maybe ahead of the curve a little bit. They're more discriminating because it also allows you to do 8.5. So if you only had a meter that gave it in thirds and you were actually at 8.5, 8.5 again is a much more precise value to have, especially if you're shooting transparency film. The difference in 8.3 and 8.5 in a transparency film is the difference in usable or not. I mean, that's how finicky, that's how exacting that medium actually is. It's again, when it works, it's great. When it doesn't work, and the reason that just so that you know, the reason that everybody insisted on shooting transparency film, and you guys know this from your own digital experience, if I were just to hand you a raw file that had no reference to it, that had no white point that you could really measure, I just handed you something. I handed you an abstract. It was just a wash of colors. And I said, color correct this for me, or print this out for me. It would be whatever you thought you wanted it to be, right? It could be completely up in the air. So for those of you who actually print your own color negative film, aren't you in there looking at those color filters all the time, trying to decide, oh, this is a little bit too yellow, this is a little bit too cyan, this is a little bit, and you're trying to make those adjustments? Well, that's entirely up to you. People who are in the industry who are spending thousands and millions of dollars on their advertising cannot have it left to chance like that. They can't just say, oh yeah, here's the raw files, go ahead and knock yourself out, or here's the color negative, go ahead and knock yourself out. So what they did was they insisted on having color transparency film, because what they would say is, you need to make it look exactly like this transparency, but that meant that the transparency has to be perfect. It has to be perfectly exposed, and it has to have the perfect color. So when you would go to press check, so any magazine, it's the thing called press check. What would happen is that they actually have your transparencies at the printer, and the stuff goes up on press, and they start pulling press sheets off, and they bring it over, and there's a light table with your transparency on it and a board, and the print of your transparency is sitting right next to that. They call that a press check. And then they call it a press proof. You actually have to sign off on it. So it is saying, yes, I accept that what you got on press is close enough to my transparency that we're going to okay it and you can use it. And that sign-off press sheet is a legal document. And so if it all goes wrong, you've got this thing that you're saying, this is what everyone agreed that this thing should look like. But it's that whole process. And again, transparency is the only way you can actually ever do that. You can't do it with a raw file, and you cannot do it with a negative. So that's why the precision of all of that became so challenging. Anyway, okay. So, but we're going to take this to another place. We are going to take this to zone system. How many people of you have ever heard of the zone system? Okay, for those of you who haven't heard it, it's an older term. How many of you guys have ever heard of Ansel Adams? Okay, great. Pretty much all of you, right? Ansel Adams, along with a guy by the name of Minor White and a couple of other people, but those are the really two big players. They're the people who came up with basically the zone system. And what they said in the zone system, now this is for film, so just keep this whole thing in mind. What they said in the whole idea of film is that really they're taking this ultimately from a print and bringing it back to film. But the whole idea of a print, and you guys have seen Ansel Adams prints, right? I mean, so Ansel Adams' mantra was that you always had to have 10 zones of tone to have what he considered to be a fully developed, completely tonal scaled print. So he would then take that print and divide it into 10 zones, and every one of those zones is discrete. And so what he starts with I'm going to take it up to I'm going to start at zone 10 and work our ways back down. All this stuff is actually on our Canvas site. So in the resources for today, this PDF is sitting right there. So again, all of those are things for you to actually take back and copy down. Now, this really applies more to people who are shooting film, but this gives us the opportunity in digital to manipulate tone to be something that we want. So I'm going to go through this part really quickly, and then I'm going to flip this over to digital. So this is just where we're going to start in this. So at any rate, In zone 10, you can see up, it's the lightest of zones all. Basically, it's the base of the paper. There's no image, it's just the base of the paper. How light is the piece of paper that you're printing on? In zone 9, it's almost white. It can be compared to white. You don't really get a sort of a difference, but you will see some gradation of value in it. So there's no detail in it, but you get some sort of gradation. In zone 8, we actually get then to, again, a lighter gray. So this would be a zone 8 that's happening right here. You can see them going from page white to a little bit of gray to a little bit more gray, and as we work all the way down, we're just going to keep building up the density of that gray. So at any rate, at zone 8, again, it is the last place. Most people would say it can have some texture in it, but it has no real detail. You haven't hit detail yet. In zone 7, this is the lightest of the grays where you have full detail. This is what we would call highlight detail, happens in zone 7. In zone 6, this is basically if you shoot Caucasian skin unfiltered on a typical thing of black and white film, a Tri-X or whatever Ilford is, or a Pan-X or any of that kind of stuff. It's basically the zone where typical Caucasian skin will fall. Zone 5, it's the mother of them all. This is middle gray. Most of you, have you heard that 18% gray is a middle gray, or an 18% gray card is a card that you use? That is true in film. That is not true. That is an 18% gray card right there. That is no longer, so we'll talk about the new standard of this. That is true for film. It's no longer true for digital. And we'll talk about the implications of that in just a second. But that is a middle gray. So a lot of people who have reflected meters, so again, we did an incident meter. That's what we were using the whole time there. But your camera, your 35 millimeter camera, the meter that's inside of that is actually a reflected meter. It's actually looking at the light that's not falling on this meter itself. It's looking at light that's reflected off of the subject, right? Again, we're going to look at meters in just a second. But anyway, that's what zone 5 is. And so if you had a gray card and you put it into your scene and you metered off that gray card, you would have perfect exposure. That was the goal. So that's what zone 5 is. Zone 4 is where you get now into a little bit darker than that. Zone 3 is where you end up with your shadow detail. This is full detail though. It's the darkest of detail, but you have full detail in zone 3. In zone 2, you do not. In zone 2, you have a sense of texture, but you do not really see detail. You get mostly a sense of gradation. In zone 1, it is near black, but it is not as black as your paper can actually do. And then black is where you have no texture, no detail. It's what they call a D-max in film. You cannot get, again, D-max is the maximum density that you can get. So anyway, that's basically the zone system. The difference in every one of these zones is a single stop. So all the stuff that we've just been doing, the difference in zone 5 and zone 6 is one stop. The difference in zone 6 and zone 7 is one stop. The difference in zone 0 and zone 1 is one stop. So you can see here, it is a 10 stop range. It's actually 9, I think. 1, yeah, we'll count this as 1. So it's a 10 stop range with zone 5 is in the middle gray. So I'm going to flip over to this screen right now and say, well, how the fuck did they come up with this, right? So this, back to my board. Okay. So 18% gray. Where the hell did they come up with that? Right? Why isn't 50% gray? I mean, what's the middle, right? Wouldn't you say 50% gray would be the middle? You would, right? That's not how it works. Again, in working with f-stops are not linear. They are what we call logarithmic because it is a doubling and a halving. So we're going to look at linear capture much later in this semester, so I'm not going to go down that road right now, but I will put it to you like this, that it's easiest to see and how they figured out why 18% gray is 18% gray. Let me make sure that this camera is still functioning. Okay. Where are you? There you are. Okay. So I'm going to start out with 100%. This is a print now. This is not film. This is not digital. This is a print. Okay. So I'm going to start out with 100. So 100% of light coming off of something. If I've got 100% is coming at me, it is what we call white. It's just what, by definition, it is white. In this case, you can't have more than 100%. I know they always tell you need to put in 120%, right? That doesn't really exist. So that's just all. So 100% by definition is white. But now we deal in f-stops. F-stops are doubling and halving, correct? So I want to go one stop down from pure white. What percentage of reflection do I get? What is half of 100? Exactly, 50. What's half of 50? So again, what I'm doing here, guys, these are stops. If I have 100% exposure here and I have white, and I go down one stop, I do not get to middle gray. I get to zone, in this case, this would be zone 7. I get to zone 6. I'm coming on down. Does that make sense what's going on here? We'll see it in just a second, don't worry. So I'm going to continue to work my way down. What's one more? What's half of 25? We're going to call it 12. We 12.5, but yeah, 12. What's half of that? 6. What's half of that? 3. And that's basically it. So if you take a look at Ansel Adams and Minor White's zone system, what you see is the scale to go from 7, which is where you have full detail, down to zone 3, which is where you have full highlight detail, where you have full shadow detail. That 5-stop range is considered the tonal range that we are trying to deal with in film based on a print. Make sense? So then here, this is my 5-stop range right here. If I start at 100, I go down, this is minus 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops, 5 stops. Oh, sorry, thank you. I'll do that again. So if we look at our scale here, I go 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops, 5 stops. What's half of 5? Oh, come on. If I had a $5 bill and I said, give me half of that, wouldn't you know how much money to give me? $2.50, right? 2.5, right? So again, if I take this down 2.5, I'm going to erase my scale up at the top. 1 stop, 2 stops, 2.5 right here. What is right? How much difference is between 12 and 25? Basically 12. What's half of 12? 6. So 18% is right here in the middle. This is why 18% is middle gray. I know, you're thinking, well, who the fuck cares, right?
No,
Hang on.
I'm thinking, I feel like that kind of confused me a little bit. So
Okay, I have a 5-stop range of tone.
yeah.
I want to be in the middle, right? This is my 5-stop range right here. So again, 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops, 5 stops. This 3%, if I've got 3% of light coming back off a print, this is black. This is white. What's right in the middle? 18%. This is middle gray. You guys do gray with an A or an E? I go back and forth all the time. I have no idea. I'm gray fluid. Does this make sense, everybody, what's going on here? Okay, so this is why 18%. So the card that Aaron had, if that is a true gray card for 18%, that is great for film, but things have changed with digital. What happened in digital was the paper that we use to print on now, 2 things have happened. Number 1, they added optical brighteners to it. So it actually reflects more light than a conventional piece of paper would actually reflect. They are hyper bright. That gave us a half a stop. But then they also increased the density of the black ink. You can get a richer black in an inkjet printer than you can in the silver print in the lab. And so those two things added another stop to this range. So in film, it's a 5-stop range. In digital, it's 6. So in digital, what happens is this continues just down further. So we go from 3 down to 1 and 1/2. So now I've got a 6-stop range for digital. So again, this is white. 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops, 5 stops, 6 stops. What's half of 6? 3. 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. 12% is considered middle gray for digital, not 18% any longer. Why does this matter to us? So let me ask you, who in this room can take a black wall and make it white? Who can take a white wall, a white door, and make it black? Who can actually take a black wall and make it any tone, white to black or anything in between? Who can take a white wall and make it any tone, all the way in between, right? Can you do that deliberately? Do you know how to meter that to do it so that you don't have to just guess? Hold that thought. We're going to get there today. Okay. Hold that thought. I'm going to be coming back to this, but for the time right now, we need to talk about meters. So, there are 2 kinds of meters, and you can see them right here. There is an incident meter, which is what we were just using out in the studio. It's the one that's got the little white dome on it, and what happens is that light falls onto this thing, and it measures simply the light that's falling onto it. You guys were pointing that little meter at the light, and the light was actually hitting it, and then you would get a meter reading. It didn't matter whether you had on a black shirt, a white shirt, a green shirt, no shirt. It didn't care what the subject was. It's just measuring the light that's falling onto it. Does that make sense? But a reflected meter, and this is the meter that you have in every 35 millimeter camera. You actually have it in most cameras. There is no camera I know of that really is designed to function like an incident meter. There used to be, back in the old days, you could get this giant cone thing that you would put on the front of a 35 millimeter camera to sort of emulate an incident meter reading. Nobody ever used it. It never really worked. But what happens in a reflected meter reading is that the light actually hits the subject and it bounces off the subject into your camera, and the light reads that amount of light. Does that make sense? Any questions about this part? Okie dokie. So the way meters, reflected meters, are designed to work is they anticipate a full tonal scene in front of them. So I'm going to kill one of these lights so you can see this a little bit better. What they do is they expect whatever you're looking at, because again, if you think about photography in general, most of the time you guys, if you go out to shoot, landscape, or you're shooting your friends out running around in the park and that kind of stuff, there's the whole cornucopia of tones, right? There's light tones, there's dark tones, there's mid tones, there's mid light tones, there's mid dark tones, there's the whole menagerie of that is in front of you. And if you point your camera at it, what your camera does is it says, okay, I'm going to do this. So watch what happens with this. I'm going to actually average all of this out. And you can see, if you average all the tones in the world that are out there, and there's just a reasonable, good, solid variation of tone, you end up with a middle gray. And so what your reflected camera does, what this thing does is it says, okay, I'm going to look at the world, whatever it is I'm looking at. I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to tell you an exposure that will render all of that out in front of me middle gray. And that's how they work. And as long as you've got a scene that looks like this, it works, because then it averages this whole scene out, and the whole scene is averaged out to middle gray. And so when your camera says, okay, shoot it f8 at 125th of a second at an ISO of 300 or 400, then this is what you get. And the system works great. Does this make sense, everybody? What's going on? Any questions about this? Okay, that's terrific until this happens. This is your scene. And again, Your camera does the same exact thing. It actually, oh here, I'm gonna actually do another one first. How many of you guys have shot in the snow and the pictures you get back are incredibly dark? This happens more than the other version of it. It happens to everybody. Why is that? What's happening is that, again, your camera being the camera, again, it doesn't know it's snowed outside. It doesn't know your scene's dominated by light tones. It simply says, okay, I'm going to average the scene and I'm going to make it middle gray. So it averages the scene. This is what we get. But the truth is, what your camera then does is it tries to make this scene this tone. Again, your camera is always doing the same thing. It's averaging what's in front of it and saying, I'm going to make that middle gray. Well, the problem is that our scene was not middle gray. Our scene was actually really light. It was full of these light tones. So what ends up happening is your camera doesn't know this. So your camera tries to make it middle gray, so your camera underexposes this scene to make it middle gray. Yes?
When you're saying what the camera is doing and choosing the settings for this, are they choosing settings? Is the camera on Apple? Or is this like when it's actually compensating for
No, it's just looking at that scene saying, I want to make this middle gray. So I want to make this tone. It works the opposite way as well. You've got a really dark scene. Your camera does the same thing. It averages this out. But now it's trying to take a scene that is really dark and make it middle gray. So it overexposes this scene. How many of you have ever shot party pictures of your friends? You go in and your camera is trying to adjust for the scene, but it's a dark room, it's whatever, and everybody just looks fucking blasted out. That's happened to all of you, hasn't it? Right? The reason it's happening is that the room is predominantly darker than middle gray, but your camera is designed to say, okay, whatever's out there, I'm gonna make it middle gray. And when that happens, the only way it can take a dark scene and make it middle gray is to overexpose it. So if your scene is middle gray and you meter it, it's fine. If your scene is light, it actually makes it darker, trying to make it middle gray, so you're underexposed. If your scene is dark, it tries to actually make it middle gray, so you're overexposed by its nature. So if you're aware of that, you can leverage this to your own benefit. And that's what we're going to do next. Is this making sense, everybody, what's going on here? Okay, this is not incident meter reading. Your incident meter reading, if we take a look at that again, it has no clue about what your subject matter is. This is measuring light falling on it. If this person is wearing white, it doesn't matter. Gray, it doesn't matter. Black, it does not matter. If this person is wearing gray, it's perfect. If they're in white, it will be under. If all I'm doing is metering off the figure, forget the rest of the scene, just the figure. If they're wearing white, it will be underexposed. If they're wearing black, it will be overexposed, because your camera is trying to make everything in the world medium gray. Are we good on this part? Okay, I'm going to pause this for 1 second and connect to, actually, we can go through this part really quickly right here first. So we're going to do this really fast. Hang on 1 second. Oh, did everybody get the extra files? Okay, good. So we're going to get into Capture One. By the way, how's the Capture One? How did the second version go? Are we still hanging in there?
Yeah.
Is everybody passing, I hope, or at least retaking it so that you can pass? Don't cheat.
They won't let you not go.
Oh, okay.
I don't think they can let you cheat.
Hopefully not. But again, to everyone's credit. Their credit, your credit, my credit. Okay, Capture One session. I'm just going to set up a new session. I'm just going to walk you through this. You're going to see this 1,000 times, but there's no reason not to actually see it here as well. So To work in Capture One, one of the biggest mistakes that everybody makes here, and again, I'm not going to go through the interface right now. You guys should have gone through part of this already. You're going to continue more. This isn't today really about Capture One, but I need to set up a capture set to actually look at what we're going to do, and we might as well go through it. So for my go-to, always in the beginning, I actually click on this plus arrow and I do a new session. So many people are doing new catalogs because when Capture One actually opens up in this, the way these computers are set up, it defaults to catalog. You do not want to shoot to catalog. You want to be doing new sessions. I don't think we've talked about naming convention in this class yet, but we will get to there. But the naming convention that I always use starts with a month, year, and day, not day, year, and month, the way that most people do in the US, because this will give me all of my sessions in chronological order. So 20250214, happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Underscore VER, that's who is actually doing the shooting. That's my initials. And then I'm going to do meter. So it's just a quick keyword about what is actually that I'm actually shooting here. In terms of the location where this actually goes, you'd want this any place but your desktop. You do not want to shoot this to a desktop. You do not want to shoot this to an external hard drive. Both of those are incredibly slow. Hard drive is slow. An external hard drive is slow because you actually have to go through the USB port or nobody has FireWire anymore. It's basically the USB port. That's the only way you can get out to one. And that is a tenth of the speed of your internal hard drive, so you always shoot to your internal hard drive. The problem in shooting to your desktop is that your desktop is actually a database, and everything that is on your desktop is kept in a database. Every time you change anything on your desktop, the entire database has to rebuild. It doesn't just say, oh, here's another entry. The whole database rebuilds. So if you've got a really crowded desktop, which you all have, and you are actually shooting to that desktop, it has to, between every single one of your captures, it's got to go in there and find every file, every XMP, everything, and recatalog it. Takes too much time. So you always shoot to a pictures folder, or you could designate another folder if you prefer to do that, but pictures is actually safest. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. You would never open this in a new window. The reason you don't want to open new windows in Capture One is that your camera can only connect to a single window or a single session. That's what this really is. And if your camera is connected to a session and you open up another brand new one, it will cover the old one. And if your camera is connected to the old one and you don't remember that that's going on, you don't see it because it's behind this whole session, you'll never be able to connect to your camera because another session owns your camera. So never, ever open multiple sessions in windows like this. Not when you're tethering. Maybe when you're editing, but not ever when you're tethering. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this. And then finally, the next and last move. I will talk about doing subfolders and all that kind of stuff later, but I always go to the tether part, next capture naming. By default, it always goes to next capture counter. You get rid of this token. You click on these little three arrows to open this up. You can now edit this. It's going to take the name. It's always going to add an extension to it, but I'm going to add to this. I'm going to put an underscore in here. I'm going to put an 01 in here, and then I'm going to do another underscore, and then these are what they call tokens. I'm going to grab this 1-digit counter token, drag it up to the top, click on the drop-down menu, and go down to 3-digit counter. This is a frame number right here. This is now what my image is going to look like, or what my naming, this is just what I'm currently shooting right now. So this is how my files will be named. So I'll know when they were done, I'll know who did them, I'll know a basic idea of what they're about. If I'm doing multiple shots today, I shoot fashion, so I do multiple shots through the day. This would be the difference in the first outfit, second outfit, third outfit, whatever, and then a frame number. And then, okay. So, yes.
Do any of the other tags include anything?
Oh, absolutely. So when we get deeper into this, you'll actually see what I typically do is I don't use this 01. What I typically do is I will make a whole series of subfolders that are in here. So in my favorites in here, this is where I'll have 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, 06. It's all separate subfolders of capture folders. And then, well, here I can show you one really quickly. I'm not really hoping to get into this part. I'll show you a better way of doing this. So in the library, if you control click on your capture folder, you can say, show this to me in the Finder. And I'm going to say, okay. And then in my Finder, I'm going to do a new folder in here, and I'm going to call it 01. And then I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to do another new folder in here. and I'm gonna call it O2. And I would go on and on and on, however many I'm gonna do. I select these two folders, I drag them over to my sessions favorites. You can now see they're O1 and O2 in here. I then click on this, control click on this to say, I want this to be my capture folder. You'll usually get a warning saying, do you want to remember the old one? In this case, it doesn't. You can see it's got a little camera right here. And then in my capture naming, instead of having this, like this, sorry, I'm going to get rid of this part right here. I'm going to leave the underscore, but instead of putting in that O1, I'm actually going to put in my destination folder. And then I put in an underscore and my frame counter. And say, okay, 3-digit. And so now you can see, because I'd set up O1 as my capture folder, it's putting in that name for me right here. So I'm going to say okay to that. If, on the other hand, I go here and I set O2 as my capture folder, it automatically changes my naming. And you'll see it's now O2. So all the other tokens definitely have a place to play. But at any rate, so I'm going to pause the video right now so that I can go over and hook it up to this camera, and then we'll start it up again. So hang on 1 second. Oh, here, click really quickly, take a look here, guys. See, this is how I actually protect this. I put this cord 3 right here, so if somebody trips on this, it doesn't yank it out of the computer. So I'm going to unwind that. But now I don't have that luxury here. I'm going to my laptop here to do this. So in terms of my laptop, what I'm going to do here is actually I'm going to do this. Probably a couple of times around. So that again, when somebody trips on this or yanks this out, this pulls and it doesn't do anything to that, and it certainly doesn't yank it out of my computer or out of my camera, either one. Does that make sense?
Do you think like taping the wires to the ground would also work?
I don't tape these to the ground because the problem with that, no, because it's a smart idea. As long as you're like a still life guy and you're never going to move anything, but the minute you tape something down, the photographer's going to say, I need to move over there.
Ow.
And then you're untaping shit and doing. It's the same thing with cords on this kind of stuff. We haven't talked about that yet. Both of me actually will. I'm going to turn this guy on. I've already reset this camera to its defaults. I know that for sure because it's still got the ISO set to auto. So I'm going to change that. Hopefully I'm connecting over here. We will find out. And it doesn't see my camera.
Do your ports ever just like decide not to work and you have to use
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah, story of my life.
Oh, just me. Okay.
No, it's not just you. Can somebody do a favor to turn that camera on and off, please?
You have multiple settings open.
Like
Say what?
consistently on and off?
One time.
No, just off and then just back on again. That's good.
Keep doing
Uh-oh.
it. Did you find it?
You have multiple sessions.
I'm sorry?
You have multiple sessions.
Oh, no, I don't ever have those. Oh, everybody over here really quick. See this error message that's sitting up on top? Can everybody see that? Come in here close and see. There's this blinking ERR that's sitting on the very top of my camera right now. Right here in this part right in here. That's a problem, right? And you would think, well, I can fix that. All I need to do is turn the camera off and then turn it back on, and you're still going to get that error message, right? So the only solution to clear this is to pull the battery out. Oh, it's probably, usually it's the buffer, but and now I'm getting a busy signal. No rest. You're supposed to count to 30. I don't ever do that, which might be the problem, but.
Like, do a lot of the issues? Can you fix a lot of these issues by like unplugging the battery?
Unplugging battery is a lot. This is now, it seems to be clear right now. I'm hoping I show up here on my screen. So I'm not showing up on my screen, so I'm going to quickly quit Capture One and then relaunch it. So if this is making you guys feel better, this happens in every studio with every photographer in the whole wide world. Repeatedly. If this doesn't somehow fuck up on some way, whatever, it's not like a complete day. Sure, go ahead, try anything. Can you unplug the cable and put it back in? Make sure I don't have another error message again. Do I have another error message blinking? Okay, good, good. Just unplug it and plug it back in, please. Ooh, that was close. Yeah, so that tells me what it is. So, as much as I showed you and as important as I think this twisting cabling part is, sometimes this causes the problem, so I'm just going to pop that out. And there you go. Okay, so you guys already know I like to shoot at f8, so I'm going to set that up here in my camera, and then I am going to calibrate my meter. So the way you do this is you put a color card in here. Yeah, that's showing on the screen. Okay. You put a color card in here, and I'm just going to shoot for you, but I'm going to get a meter reading quickly and just see. Watch your eyes. So to check to make sure that all of your lights are going, so if I did this right now, again, did they both go?
Yeah.
How do you know? Can you see both of them at the same time? Not possible. So you do this. You do not do this. That one's going. You can always see it on your hand. Yeah, you can see it on my hand here.
Yeah.
All right, so they're both going. So again, you need to know that because if not, this matters. So I'm going to take my trusty little meter. I'm actually going to do an incident reading here. So I'm set at 125th of a second. I'm going to change my ISO up to 100 because that's what I've got my camera set at. I'm going to prime it and pop it. And it says 11.5. It's a little too hot for me. I want to be at 8, right? So I want to lose how much? Half stop will give me to 11. I want to shoot at 8. Stop and a half, right? So the closest I can get really probably is 1, 2, 3. That knocks one stop off. One more is probably going to knock another stop off. It'll be close. Pro Photo is a little bit more discriminating than Speed of Charm. Speed of Charm works in third. So this gives me an 8.1. Close enough, right? And 80.1. Yeah, you guys got that. So then I'm going to shoot a picture of this. I'm zoomed in as much as I can get in. Okay, that did not fire. And now I look like an idiot because I haven't put this on, right? So everybody write this down. Right now, get something to write this down with. This is the best piece of advice I will give you all semester. In all 15 weeks, the number one thing is coming at you right now. Everybody ready? So when that happens, you immediately look at everybody and you go, ambient light check. Because that's what it is, right? I've just made an exposure that had no strobe. So then I can come over to my screen. I can keep the light going. I can come over to my screen and look at here, and I can hover around it. I can see, wow, I don't see any ambient light here except for the highlights that are actually on those two C-stands that are in the back. Other than that, my reading in the very center is actually zeroed out. It's a way to cover it. It makes it look like instead of the mistake that you made, that you did it deliberately because this then gives you the information that you want, right? Okay, so then hopefully that one will work. Although this is now set at F7, so let's try it at F8. So then, if you can't see, come over here, look at my screen, or look at the screen that's up there, either one. I'm going to zoom in on this. First thing I'm going to do is realize that I'm out of focus. So again, that's not a movie. You don't make this with the photographer and say, by the way, you're out of focus, in front of the entire crew, the staff, the creative people, the art director. They don't do that. Just say, you're out of focus. But I can still do my metering part here. So again, I'm going to come over to my area right over here. I'm going to pick my white balance tool. I'm going to click on the patch of gray that's right next to the red. We'll talk about why that is later on. Measure that. And then look at the little white patch that's up here, and you'll see it reads a 239. So what that's telling me is that, again, the thing that you should know about this is that that little white patch, if this is properly exposed, the scale, the range that we work in our tonal range in Capture One, in Photoshop, all of that, is a scale of 0 to 255. Is everybody kind of aware with that part? Does anybody not know that part?
Could you say it one more time?
So again, the scale in Photoshop, the scale in Capture One, the scale from 0 in Photoshop, or in Capture One is black, 255 is white. That's my scale, my range, right? This little white patch is a real thing. It actually has texture to it. I don't want this to be 255, that would be page white. I need it to be a little bit less than that, but I need to be very close to that for proper exposure. So my target for this white patch, once I have white balance this, is always 245 to 250. That's always what I'm looking for. Right now I'm reading a 239. Again, there's no real perfect way to say, oh, you're a 239, you need to do this much. I'm going to add a third of a stop to this, just by one click up. Pop your pack a couple of times. I'm going to shoot another frame. No, actually, I'm going to put this on autofocus because that's the subject right now. So at least we'll be looking at something that's in focus. And I'm going to hover over this white patch again, and I'm reading 245. This is perfect exposure for me. So then I can take my meter again and go back in. I'm going to prime it again and do another fire on this. And I'm reading an 8.4 here. But this whole system that I've got going on right now is telling me that this is wrong. This is off by a third of the stop. This is reading too hot by a third of the stop. So then I simply hold my ISO button in and drop this down till I read 8.1. So even though this meter is now set for an ISO of 80, it matches the 100 ISO of this camera. Does that make sense? And as long as I keep that in mind, I could always keep it also in mind that this meter is reading a third of a stop too hot. So I could always just meter something and knock a third of a stop off. Does that sort of make sense, everyone? So this gives me basically where I want to be with this. This is how you calibrate these meters. So now this meter, as long as I don't change either of these ISOs, I'm good to go. If I change my ISO to like 400, I know again I need to knock a third of the stop off the pad, and I simply do it here on the camera, on my meter. You can figure out what the difference, what your new ISO would be. But that's how you actually calibrate these two, so that they agree with each other. So that makes this thing even more useful. It's close. This is actually being a third of the stop off is not the end of the world unless you're shooting transparency film. Okay, I'm gonna pull this thing out. This does say I'm reading f8. So I'm simply going to do a picture of, I'm going to throw my autofocus back off now because it probably is going to have a really hard time tracking on that. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do a reflected reading. Now this is all gone right, and that is a middle grade. This thing should actually read f8, reflected, right? So prime this, point it right at it, so you'll actually see you're taking this little reflected thing where, and just like your camera, you're going to point it right at that thing. So I'm going to point it right at that thing and fire this, and 8.1. So they agree. So that is a middle gray. So then I shoot this, and lo and behold, I look at it, and it says, okay, yeah, middle gray. I look at this, that looks like a middle gray too, correct? Okay. I'm going to do another meter reading on this now. Prime my meter. Point it at the white, shoot it. This is saying 11.4. Let me read this. So I'm just going to do it over from here. It's roughly 11 and a half. I don't have halves on this, but I will go to 11. So again, this is, nobody gets into 13. That's 11 and a third, but nobody does that. Anyway, I'm going to shoot that again. And lo and behold, is that white? No. Middle gray. Not exactly, but close. Try one more meter read on that. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. Again, not white, middle gray. I'm going to try black now. Now, this is not a true black. This has actually got a sheen to it, which is going to throw things off a little bit, but you'll get the idea. Five, six. Is that black? No. These are all middle grays that it is pushing us to. So everybody back over. You're going to hear this. You're not going to, well, yeah, hang on. You will see this. Okay, we got 5 minutes to get through this. And then everybody's going to help me tear this down like a banshee. Still in focus. Okay, guys, so back to our setup right here. So what's happening is that when I use that reflected meter reading, it is always trying to get me to this 12% right here. This is what it's trying to give me my exposure is, right? So I can define white and black based on this middle gray. So look at this. So what's happening right now is this is the exposure it's giving me right here no matter what. I can take that meter reading, and if I overexpose by 3 stops, what happens? I go up 1, 2, 3. Normal plus 3 stops equals white. I can do the opposite. I can go down 1, 2, 3. Normal minus 3 stops equals black. This is how you do it. So going back to our screen really quickly, back to our camera session, let's see if this actually works. Capture one. Don't try this at home. So going back to capture 1, I can see So I have my camera up again. So I'm reading 5.6 right now. Remember I said if we take this, no matter what it is, and I add 3 stops to this, it should be white. This is my normal. I'm going to do plus 3 stops, right? Instead of doing this with an aperture, I'm just going to do it with my ISO. So what's 3 stops more ISO from 100? Quickly. 1 stop is 200. 2 stops is 400. 3 stops is 800. I'm going to change this to an 800 ISO. And do another frame. White, 241, close enough. I'm going to go back to my white. In my white setting, I was reading 11.7. Back to 100 ISO, 11.7. So I'm going to go back to 11.7, which was 14. I'm still going to add those 3 stops. White, or we'll get there. Same thing. If, on the other hand, I can get down 3 stops, I'm going to just completely turn this off and do a reflected reading on my background. So my camera is now saying that at 125th of a second, I'm a 0.7. So basically, I'm going to go to a 15th of a second. That would set me at 2. An 1/8 of a second at 2.8 should give me middle gray. 1/8 of a second, 100 ISO, 2.8, 1/8 of a second. That was not an 1/8 of a second. White balance this, again, middle gray. But now if I underexpose this by 3 stops, so if I go 3 stops down, so an 1/8 of a second to a 15th to a 30th to a 60th, 3 stops down, black. So this whole 3 stops up, 3 stops down, realize your meter's always giving you middle gray, but you can turn this into any tone that you want this to be. And the minute you go into a studio and you take a black seamless and you turn it white in front of a client, they're going to fucking drop on their knees and bow to you like the God that you are. Make sense? Questions? Okay, we'll get to the rest of this stuff next week. If you guys can help me break all of this down as quickly as we can, the staff, the crew, everyone will fall in love with you and treat you really kind and nice.
More stuff for my research portfolio. When I was looking through images I'm picking, that's gonna say, like, this is gonna be a lot more work.